So enjoy, and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much, and it's nice to see you all. I actually thought I was going to talk about St. Hilda because it was part of a series about different Celtic aspects of spirituality. But I will weave in how my own community of Aidan and Hilda reflects something of her spirituality today. First question, why is St. Hilda's College, Oxford, named after St. Hilda? I expect you to know the answer by the end of the talk, but not before. But a book is coming out, published from BRF at Abingdon in March, so I've been living into St. Hilda, and I think she's one of the most remarkable women in our land and has a great deal to tell us. When the English nation was being formed, when the people's gods lost their shine and the true God began to loom large, when its church was like a chrysalis emerging from its Irish womb, but did not yet know how to fly, God placed a shining woman on a throne not made by man, at the centre of two worlds no one else could span. Her name was Hilda. And in our multicultural society, with so many pressures, and in a world that fears a clash of civilizations, at a time when Pope in Rome has appointed the first ever woman cardinal, but will find it rather difficult to take further steps, perhaps, we have a great deal to learn from Hilda. She was born as a royal in the house of Deira, which is more or less modern Yorkshire, at the time when the Anglo-Saxon invaders had colonized parts of what is now England. The largest of their kingdoms, they were all pagans of course, was Northumbria. But at first Northumbria was two different kingdoms and Deira was the southern one. Hilda was brought up with a very difficult childhood because her mother, while pregnant, found persecution coming because these Anglo-Saxon kings killed each other and killed off any possible heir. And Hilda's father was a possible heir, Hereric. So he fled to the little Celtic sub-kingdom of Elmet, near today's Leeds, probably because they had connections there. And he was poisoned, probably by the man who usurped the throne of Hilda's Deira. So here is Hilda's mother with one daughter and the baby in her womb, searching for a husband who she never found because he'd been poisoned. A pagan. But she had this vision. And the vision was, as she was searching in the folds of her cloak, that she came across the most wonderful jewel, and its light shone throughout all of Britain. That means the Celtic lot as well as the Saxon lot. And she realized that this vision was referring to the baby in her womb. Oh, the wonder of an unborn baby, even in the hardest of circumstances. And we learn that Hilda, who grew up with pagan parents, whose uncle Edwin, who later became king, was a pagan, and he got the throne of York, and so Hilda was able to move into York. But how does she become a Christian? Well, God also spoke in visions to her uncle Edwin. He fled because his opponent was after his life to all sorts of places, and eventually ended up at King Redwall's court in East Anglia. This was in the 7th century. And King Redwall was wondering whether to accept the Christian God or the pagan God, and he had an altar to both in his chapel. He was hedging his bets. But he did later become a Christian, and while Edwin was seeking sanctuary there, he had a vision of a young man with a crown, but the crown wasn't a Saxon king's crown, it was a crown of thorns. And the young man said to him, just supposing somebody visited you and told you that you were to be king on one condition, that you followed the advice of one who is much wiser than you, and that you carried out all his commands, would you do so? Yes, said Edwin. And the story goes that sometime later he met Bishop Paulinus, who had been sent by the Pope from Rome to convert the Anglo-Saxons from a base in Kent. And so Paulinus introduced Edwin to the Christian faith. But he didn't become a Christian first. He held out for a long time, but eventually he did. And he and Hilda and thousands of others were baptized at Easter in a little church at York. And if you go to the crypt of York Minster, you will see something recognizing that fact. So Hilda became a Christian. Now, this is very important for us today. God can speak to non-Christians. I know you all know that, but you know an awful lot of Christians don't believe that. And he can speak through dreams. Many Muslims are having dreams of Jesus. I had a phone call from a man in Glastonbury. He said, I'm not a Christian, I've never read the Bible, but I've had a dream. And in the dream, a hand came down from heaven, a white hand, and into my heart. And I started, when I woke, I was sobbing for 3 days and couldn't work. And I went to see a local vicar, and he said, it's the Holy Spirit that's given you this dream. So the man said, I've read your book, Exploring Celtic Spirituality. Can I come on your retreat you're running in Glastonbury? So we said yes. And he read a passage from the Bible for the first time in his life and came to know Jesus. So the sort of thing that happened to Hilda in a hard place can also happen today. But the hard times of Hilda weren't over. She had later to go into exile because her uncle Edwin was killed. Where would they go? They fled, probably, to relatives in East Anglia because Hilda's sister, Hereswith, had married Ethelwald, who later became co-king of the East Anglians and was a convinced Christian. So many people are asylum seekers and refugees today all over the world. Think of the Syrians. Hilda was a refugee. She could have become withdrawn and hard and bitter, but she didn't. She grew into a very loving, very outgoing woman. What was the secret? Well, one secret, no doubt, was that the family she took exile with, she went to in exile, was very loving, but they were open to influences for good in Christianity, both from the Roman tradition and the Irish tradition. And it's quite likely that while Hilda was in exile in East Anglia, she met or certainly heard about Bishop Felix, who was brought in from Burgundy and who spread the faith from Dunwich or Felixstowe. And she would have heard about the Irish monk Fursey, who'd been invited in because they weren't prejudiced. He was a prophetic, wandering monk and who had visions, and he was invited to their client state of what we now call Essex, East Saxons, who were linked together. And he used to tell everybody about the 12 fires about to divide the earth. Fires of covetousness, discord, falseness, and so on. And every time he told about his vision, he sweated profusely. He was so empowered to communicate. God wanted people to turn to him. So Hilda became aware of these Christian influences and no doubt learned from them. We don't know where she lived, but we do know from archaeology that there were excavations at Rendlesham, which was a major royal centre, which you can visit, and there was a smaller one at Exton, about 10 miles from Ely. And it's possible that her sister and her husband had their royal baby there, and that Etheldreda, as she's sometimes known, who later founded the community, which is now the site of Ely Cathedral, was a little infant when Hilda was staying there, and so it's quite possible that Hilda sang songs to her and taught her stories of Jesus and was a bit of a mentor to Etheldreda. Well, time went by, and the man who had killed her Uncle Edwin and come to the throne, he lost his head, chopped off. They were always chopping off each other's heads. Pagan. And his children had fled, in order not to have their heads chopped off, to sanctuary in the northern border of Northumbria, which was an Irish Christian colony. Christians from Ireland colonised the area now more or less Argyll, made it into a colony called Dalriada. And these royal children in exile there was a kind of treaty of friendship made by the royals of Dalriada. They went to Iona, they met the brothers, they were baptized as Christians, and they had the right in law for 2 generations to the throne, even though they were in exile. And eventually one of them, Oswald, with the support of the Christian Irish, marched across and took the throne. Before that, there was 1.5 years of ghastly bloodshed, killing and ravaging. The whole Northumbria was a place of killing fields. Hilda must have again been in exile and got out of it. Some time or other, somewhere or other, we don't know, she met the man who Oswald invited to bring an Irish mission to the English people, as we now call them, the Anglo-Saxons. Aidan came from Iona, and his approach was in stark contrast to that of the Roman missionaries that Hilda had known. An extraordinary contrast. The first thing that I like to think that Oswald, who we know was very magnanimous and who was very good at getting on with people and making friends, and came down here to Wessex and was godfather to the king at his baptism and married into the Wessex royal family. He was awfully good at winning battles when he had to, but if he could possibly alliances and friendships, he did that instead. I think it's most in character that he invited the former royals, even from the family that had killed his father, to come back. Now that there was safety, there was a recovering organisation, and there was a living faith at the royal headquarters which was turning everything round. Anyway, she came. Perhaps she came to Bamberg, the royal headquarters. She meets Aidan. The first thing that would have struck her was the difference in dress between Bishop Aidan of the Irish and Bishop Paulinus from Italy. Bishop Paulinus dressed as a dignitary, and his idea for spreading Christianity throughout the world was to make the church the most prestigious organisation in the world, a bit like Cardinal Wolsey here. And therefore you have best buildings, best libraries, and you deck up the clergy as mini emperors, put the bishops on thrones, and so on. Aidan dressed as a simple peasant. He refused to ride a horse because only top people rode horses, and he wanted to be with the ordinary people at the bottom of the pile. If rich people gave him money, he would not spend one penny on church buildings. He gave it all to the poor. So that was a huge difference that Hilda would have seen, both in his dress, in what he did with money. But secondly, she saw another difference, that the Roman approach was to command the workers to come to a royal centre, to hear Christianity taught, and then to be baptized. And then, once they'd become Christians, they had Christianity meant leaving your farmstead, the open air, your natural familiar territory, and going into a building called a church, which was alien to them. Aidan's approach was the exact opposite. He said, no, I and my brothers will walk among the people and go to them. And if we're killed, so be it. We won't have bodyguards. And we will not, so Christianity was an outdoor thing. They could experience Jesus where they were, in their own familiar territory, in the creation. And the extraordinary thing is that people took to these brothers. When they heard that they were coming, they would run out of their villages, kneel down and say, please pray for the sign of the cross. They prayed for healing, they baptized them. They went to their villages. And of course, this took an awful long time. Oswald must have been a bit disappointed because he had a kingdom 300 miles from Humber to further forth, from Carlisle to the east coast, a huge area. And Aidan wanted to walk everywhere. You're never going to evangelize that vast area. Walking everywhere, he thought, probably. But what happened was it was so successful, a bit like Jesus of Nazareth, it was his approach, which must have annoyed certain people. It was so successful that they sent back to Iona, back to Ireland, back to Riada, said, please send more and more people who will each do the gently, slowly approach. Culture-friendly mission. So Hilda was very, very impressed by that. I think she was also impressed by another thing. Before Aidan had come, there'd been a failed first mission. And he'd said to the brother who'd failed, brother, I think you should have given them the milk of the Word of God before you gave them the meat, and you should not have imposed on them our standards, our ways. I think when Aidan talked about milk, he was thinking of a mother's milk, coming from inside the breast of a woman, going into the inside of an infant. And he was thinking of the gentle nurturing, so that something goes inside the souls of the people. And if the king has his head chopped off or there's a battle, the milk will still be inside them, so to speak. And the milk of human kindness and the milk of the Word of God was the same thing, because it was the living of it and the theory of it became one. So that was a very, very different approach. And I think also in Ireland, where Aidan had come from, they had had a wonderful imagination. And they had the idea, instead of having an inferiority complex or becoming Mormons, saying Jesus had to visit America, because America is a very important place and the scriptures don't report that he came there, so you can start a new religion. Or Prophet Muhammad, blessed be he, feeling that the Arabs are not mentioned in any scriptures. So you have revelations to show that God has a plan for the Arabs. Now the Irish were on the edge of the world, they thought, that they could have had an inferiority complex because they weren't mentioned in any scriptures, but they didn't. They had a legend, perhaps they told Hilda, so that's a bit of a stretch. The legend is that when Jesus Christ rose from the dead, he leapt across the planet, and wherever his shadow fell became a holy place. And his shadow fell on an extremely large number of places in Ireland. And so there were holy places everywhere. But also, Jesus had 12 apostles to bring in the kingdom of God for 3 years in a little place called Judea in the Roman Empire. So Ireland would have its 12 apostles, but they read Luke's gospel very well. Jesus also had his 12 spiritual foster mothers. And you couldn't possibly have done the work without the foster mothers. I mean, they they did the food, they looked after the purse, they kept all those men going who went off into the villages, and then they were chatting to people who came to them at the home base, as it were, as they travelled around. When the men ran away when Jesus was crucified, the women didn't. They stayed at the cross. And it was to a woman that the first resurrection appearance came. The Irish picked all that up because they'd already got the spiritual foster mothers in pagan times. And they said, Ireland needs its 12 apostles and its 12 spiritual foster mothers. And the foster mothers were people who parted the wisdom of their people, the social skills, the memory, and as they became Christians, they taught them the gospel stories, they taught them how to pray, they taught them how to overcome temptations and how to grow holy and whole as human beings. And they used to teach them little sayings and answer questions and so on. They taught them awareness. Well, I think Aidan realised that there are some parts of the English God would never reach without the women. To slightly misquote an advert for some beer. Reaches the parts others cannot reach. And I suspect that he talked with Hilda about that. So all we know is that Hilda was deeply, deeply attracted by the Irish spirituality. I think she was attracted by its naturalness, its authenticity, its connection with God in creation, as well as those other, and among the poor, as well as those other things I've said. But somehow or other, Hilda went into exile again because Oswald had his head chopped off. It's a terrible tragedy. Must have been heartbreaking for Aidan. And they no longer together. She was back in East Anglia. But there was another influence coming into Hilda's life through her sister. In what is now France, Gaul as it then was, the Irish monk Columbanus had spread many, many monasteries among men, which were quite different to anything else they'd known. It set off a movement. And some of the aristocratic Frankish women were absolutely inspired by this, so they started women's foundations, or in some cases foundations for men and women, led by an abbess, with the Irish kind of approach, which was very rigorous, very clear rule of life, but deeply human. And For the women who just suffered endless agonies and bloodbaths, and married and then the men get killed and they're just thrown off and they're nothing, it was a wonderful form of liberation to be able to go to a place that had stability, prayerfulness, learning and respect. So Hilda's sister, perhaps after her husband died, was set to take the nun's vow at Chelles in what is now France. And Hilda was all set to join her. But Aidan heard about it. And I think he thought to himself, oh, what a missed opportunity. I've been longing for the English to have the spiritual foster mothers like the Irish do. And here the person, the woman who could really make it happen is going off and leaving us. And I think he was probably heartbroken. But how do you train people when you've no women's monasteries? On the continent, it's unthinkable for men and women to do things together. Anyway, he sent a message to misquote Lord Kitchener of later years, "Your country needs you." And she came. She showed what deep respect she had for Aidan. And she agreed to stay in Northumbria, and he said, "We'll train you, I and my colleagues, we'll be your soul friends, we'll visit you regularly and introduce you." I'm sure Hilda was very well read, probably better read than they were, something. But that's what they did. And she did a little group of women, she led a little group of women, probably Montweir now for a year, and then went to Hartlepool, which I shall go on to on Saturday, to the site of St Hilda's community there, now called St Hilda's Church on the Headland. And that went extraordinarily well, and that became a double monastery with a way of life probably inspired by Aidan and the Iona way of life of Columbkill, and perhaps also by the Columbanus tradition, but also by Hilda's herself. And then something began to change. After Oswald was killed, his half-brother came to the throne, Oswald, who was more of a nominal Christian, and he'd married a princess from Kent who followed the Roman tradition, was a distant relative of Hilda. And after Aidan's death, King Oswy asked Hilda to head up a new or a reformed monastic community for men and women at Whitby. And it became the largest community for men and women among the English. And it had a huge influence. But not only did she do that, Oswy was a bit of a bargainer with God. His wife said to him, "Tell God you'll give him 12 lands for monasteries if he lets you win this battle, and that we'll dedicate our newborn daughter to God as a virgin, as a bride of Christ, and Hilda can mentor her for the rest of her life, if we win the battle." Well, they did win the battle, so they gave all these lands for monasteries. And Hilda adopted and Elfrida mentored her. She was a spiritual foster mother to her. So here you have Hilda, deeply committed to the Irish tradition, yet making great and loving friendships with the Queen and her daughter, going to Whitby. After a time, the King called a synod at Whitby, which was a tribute, of course, to Hilda, that she could host this, and it was to discuss the date of Easter and whether Northumbria should go the Roman way or the Irish way. Most scholars think that it was a political thing, and he'd made his mind up before it all began. But they went through due process and had two delegations giving long speeches, and both of them used arguments which were faulty. But the Irish were outmanoeuvred and outclassed. One of those, the leading spokesman for the Roman side, was Bishop Wilfrid. And here was Hilda providing accommodation without prejudice, with care for all. Now Wilfrid, you can imagine what he'd have demanded for his accommodation. He was an absentee bishop for 3 years because he didn't think much of Celtic bishops. And so he went to the continent, got 3 bishops to consecrate him there, and 9 priests to hold him up on a throne, to carry him on a throne. So this was Wilfrid's approach. You can imagine him coming, I don't like this and I do like it. The Irish from Lindisfarne came, who never ever complained about. They had very, very simple and frugal habits, so they were just happy to have what they were given. Hilda, just without any fear or favour, gave everybody an equal welcome. But the Roman argument won, and she voted with the Irish, who lost, but she completely, wholeheartedly carried on under the new framework, the new Roman framework. All the Irish monks of Lindisfarne left forever, went back to Ireland, 30 of the Saxons. It was a huge trauma, and it must have been devastating for everybody who loved the Irish approach to spirituality. But it wasn't the end of their Irish spirituality, because there were appointments. There were people who'd gone from the Lindisfarne school, who were bishops and so on, who stayed in post in other places. And Hilda, I think, maintained the essential core of that spirituality under the different framework and regulations of the Roman settlement. And that, I think, is a very important insight. And when she was at Whitby, she introduced holistic learning. Somebody said when they removed the universities from the monasteries, the universities lost something. Well, I think they may have gained something too, but what they did lose very often was holistic learning. So, for example, Hilda trained them in books and scriptures in the morning. She sent her students out among the villages, the pagan villages, in the afternoon without any money or anything, to just depend on God and build relationships and learn through experience, sandwich courses we might call them. And her apprentices, there are some amazing stories. 5 or 6 of them became bishops. John of Beverley was one who had a great healing ministry and so on. Well, one of the most famous stories of all was of Captain, the cowherd, who was completely unlettered, who looked after the cows at night. And they used to have in the hinterland of the monastery, where all the farm work went on, a big gathering with a warm fire, and they passed a little harp round, and everybody, it was a karaoke in those days, without the machine. Everybody took their turn to sing a little song or a rhyme. Captain was so shy that he slipped out and went back to his hut. There he dreamt that a shining man came to him and said, "Sing." And he said, "I'm too frightened to sing in front of that crowd. Sing to me then. What shall I sing about? Sing about the creation of the world." And he did. And he could remember when he woke up. And he told his foreman, who realized that it was an extraordinarily good piece of poetry and song. And he got the message back to Hilda up at the monastery, who, though she was incredibly busy, because she was the equivalent of the principal of a theological college, the head of a big estate, and the counsellor to a very large number of people beyond her own kingdom, she took seriously this possibility of a great gift in an uneducated cowherd. That says a lot for her. So she brought him in, and they taught him a Bible story and said, "Go back and see if you can write a song." And he did. He remembered the story and the song. And he came back and he repeated another one the next day and so on. So they brought him in as a lay brother, and he became the first pop singer of English, the gospel songs. But he was also known as the father of English poetry. He ought to be on that plinth at Trafalgar Square. And it's a pity that we've lost almost all, except for a fragment in Bede, which refers to Middle-earth, which of course is explored in the Lord of the Rings films, the whole idea of the Middle-earth. But what we do know is that his poems and songs went around in English, whereas the church, up to that point, it had Latin, which was a living language, but only educated people used Latin. And now, through Hilda's affirming of that gift, the faith was going among the ordinary peasants. And the Cadman School of Poetry, as it has been called, thrived. And the Dream of the Rood, a great, wonderful poem, is one of the fruits of that school of poetry. And so we often in the community of Aidan and Hilda use the story of Cadman as a parable, that our call is to unlock the song in every human heart. Well now, things, I must draw it to an end. I can talk about her dying, it was the most wonderful vision of her going to heaven. I could talk about Dracula, because Whitby has been taken over by Dracula. And I could talk about her legacy. Why did so many colleges, like here in Oxford, name themselves after Hilda in that great period when women's education came in 2 centuries ago? I think because she pioneered, and she was a wonderful beacon of education. And after the Normans came, they rubbished the role of women. If you go into Durham Cathedral, you'll see a little row of black tiles by the entrance, beyond which no woman was allowed for 900 years. And I was at a meeting of the movement of women in the church some years back, when the Dean of Durham said, "We have invited women back after 900 years, symbolically by having an icon of Our Lady in one place and an icon of Hilda in another." But on our cross of the community of Aidan and Hilda, which began in the 1990s, we have A for Aidan and H for Hilda. We believe that women are not called to behave like men. The very worst clergy are men who behave like women and women who behave like men. What we want are people who are truly God-given icons of manhood and womanhood of people. And so we're great believers in that polarity, equality, or partnership. Two people from different genders, different races, who are soul friends for the common good. And Hilda has become an icon of wisdom as the years have gone by. Holy wisdom, Sophia, and the nurturing of mother. And I hope very much that this is something that will be recovered. And so in our community of Aidan and Hilda, we seek lifelong learning. We seek a daily rhythm of prayer, work and recreation. We seek to revive the custom of the soul friend. We share our journey with the soul friend. We seek to unlock the song that is locked up somewhere in every human heart. And we are seeking to weave together again the God-given strands in Christianity which have become separated, not by some pontifical committee from on high, but by valuing that which is of God in another tradition and weaving together, as Hilda did. And I hope very much that you may want to ask questions. We've got books here and leaflets, so please help yourself to leaflets or buy books. I end the book that's coming out in March with imagining all the Goths and the Dracula fantasists who flocked to Whitby, climbing up the 199 steps to the cross of St. Cadman, which has Hilda on it, and the cross, which is the tree of life, speaks, filled with blood, because it's all about vampires, these Dracula people, succulent blood. There are 200 films. It's a new series on the BBC starting this month. It's absolutely extraordinary, the power of it, and all the kids go to the Twilight films. And so it's very, very important that we have this idea that there's a greater power to overcome, than all the people who suck the blood out of life. And the tree speaks. Blood is flowing through it. And it speaks about life eternal. And Hilda's wonderful decision in a terrible illness she had for 6 years, she ceased not to give thanks night or day. So she's a wonderful icon of that. And I imagine that all these people coming up the steps hear a song being sung. Faithful host and reconciler, staying true through shifting ties, thankful in success and trial, always fair and always wise, meditator, motivator, wisdom's gem and heaven's prize. Mother of a million children, it's you and I, wisdom's icon, paradigm. Spill your seed into new peoples, souls from every realm and clime, songs releasing, poems making, pains embracing, with us shine. Thank you.
Would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment? Could you come up, David, because I think you'll be better heard.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
I wonder if you could outline what were the various features of the Irish as different from the Latin or Roman Act that were put to the Synod of Whitby, and what ceased and what came as a result of it.
Yes,
Sort of
the presenting issue was the date of Easter, which is incredibly complicated. And neither the Roman nor the Irish arguments were correct. I mean, the Roman argued that they were following Peter, which is of course nonsense. The Irish argued that they were following John. But I think one of the points for the Irish was that because Rome had brought in a new date for Easter, which was symbolically and administratively more convenient, the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. The Irish said there are certain years when there are days with more dark than light. And in the Old Testament, you always follow creation in discovering the date of the Passover. And because they had this deep connection with creation, they thought it felt violated by a kind of an administrative thing being more dominant than what seemed innately right from creation. And I think because Ireland was the first country outside the Roman Empire to become Christian, and it was entirely rural, it had Christianity took in a very different way, whereas on the continent you had the Roman law system, the imperial system of administration, and the church followed that by and large. It had dioceses and parishes, bishops on thrones and so on. So there was a very different feel about the Irish approach. I think the Irish were intuitive, and their communities were really kings and bishops were part of the Christian community of the tribe, the extended family. And it was a sense of family which everybody belonged. Rather than a building, with a boss and a list of rules which decided whether you were in or out according to Christian way. So it's a different field. But I think the other thing was the monastic tonsure. The Celtic monks shaved off the hair at the front, if they had any, but they wore it long at the back, which was the glory of Celtic men. The Roman monks had to shave off right round the back as well as the front, so that was another thing that changed. We don't actually know the details of other things, but we do know that when St Cuthbert was put in charge of Lindisfarne after the Irish had all left, the English brothers that remained kept complaining about all the new regulations. So we do know that there are an awful lot of changes in little things.
Anybody else? like to ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Well, just to add a point to that, this is about the Roman imperial structure.
Yes.
I'm sure that's right, and we've still got it. Because dioceses and parishes, I mean, that whole kind of top-down organisation came with the Roman system. And what's starting to emerge is something different, because churches gathered where there was a brother somewhere who had called people together. In the Irish model. And that's what seems to be starting to happen in what we call emerging church and fresh expression.
Thank you, which has reminded me of the Great Emergence. Phyllis Tickle, who's a writer in the USA, has written this book called The Great Emergence, and she traces 400 or 500 year periods of Christian history when Christianity has begun to die out and then it's been renewed. And she thinks that many people today are saying that the Christendom model, which is rather the top-down model, is dying in the world. And so some people are writing off Christianity, but actually other people are saying no, there's a great emergence, something is being born, which is bottom-up rather than top-down, but it's too early to say exactly how it'll take. But I was in Clonmacnoise in Ireland 2 weeks ago giving a talk, and they were the great university, monastic community which claimed it founded Oxford. They told me that. There you are, but I can't go into that. But they're trying to reconnect with there are several hundred Irish foundations throughout Europe to trace the ancient paths, because and then to see how the new monastic and fresh expressions of church can link in with this, and a whole new all sorts of new creative networks, liquid church as it's called sometimes, and so the question is, what is the essence of this Irish thing that is being reactivated? And I would say it is the idea of Christianity as relationship more than rule. That's the heart of it. And it's very exciting. And you can be fully Catholic with a small c, through relationship rather than through regulation.
I would like to add to that it seems to me that people from Celtic traditions are incredibly rooted with creation and the whole thing of reality. Would you agree?
You think the Celtic tradition?
Yes.
Yes, I think roots are absolutely fundamental. Roots, rhythms and relationships. I mean, I often dialogue with Muslim friends in Edinburgh when they evangelise in the Royal Mine of Edinburgh on my day off, because I come from the Holy Island of Lindisfarne, which is Aidan's outpost in England. It's the Irish mission was based. But I say to them, I've got very good news for you. You have kept up the link between the rhythm of the sun rising at its height and going down and the rhythm of prayer. You got it from Christians and Jews, but the Christians in the West forgot it, let it go. But we've got Christians recovering it now, who follow a way of life, who follow the rhythm. And it's not just an accident, it's something that God intends, so that the sun rising is a prompt to us to rise up with God. The sun settling down is a prompt to us to settle down with God. So the rhythms of creation and the rhythms in our soul are somehow linked. And I think that the roots, if we image Christianity as a tree, our task today, and the tree is getting hollow, and people say, oh, it might fall down, it's 2,000 years old. Our task is to reconnect with the root system, which the roots are things like the rhythm, the soul friendship, the communing with God in creation, the soul friends, these things. And with that, all sorts of new endogenous growths grow up inside the old tree. Yes, sorry.
Fran, could you come up?
I'm a bit husky, but I'll do my best. I was interested when you said uprising in the morning with the sun and then settling down at night. I happen sounds a bit casual, but I am in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and we share the tradition, which I think is Jewish, of sunset for the beginning of the day. And I'd love to hear a comment on that. And I'd also like, even publicly, to say, a long time ago, I was on Lindisfarne, and I had no bed for the night, and somebody gave me a bed in your house. You were away, but I slept in it.
Well, I'm glad the news of the world isn't here. Well, yes, Bishop Callistos came and gave a wonderful talk in the garden opposite our retreat house here at Open Gate on God and creation and in the Orthodox liturgy, and the reason that the day starts what we might call the evening before. I think, and of course that is what the Jews did, which is why they took Jesus off the cross, because the eve of the Sabbath was beginning on Friday night. I think that's a very important part of our understanding of rhythm. And the Orthodox have never quite lost it, have they? And some of the other churches in the West have lost that.
The Catholic Church has it. In Malta, they start at 3 or 5 p.m. That's the next.
Yes, indeed. In the monasteries.
No, this is throughout Malta.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I haven't quite got, excuse me, I haven't quite got this question clear in my head, but I'll do my best. I was very interested in what you were saying about the different structures of authority between the Irish/Celtic approach and the Roman/Anglo-Saxon. Have I got those divisions quite right? Because here was Hilda, an English Anglo-Saxon, who managed to break against that and against that tradition in her own background, and others followed that pattern too. And then a bit later on we talked a bit about the distinction between, now I'm not sure whether it's between men and women or between male and female, because I think that isn't necessarily completely overlapping for all sorts of reasons. And the nurturing side of humanity, which I would agree with you, has been very undervalued and dumbed down in our kind of materialist capitalist society. Not paid well, which is how we value things, of course. And that can be in men as well as women. That's really the point I was going to make. But I wanted to reflect about it for today. And it's wonderful that your community is doing what it is, and others too, obviously. But if you just think about the world out there, and I don't mean university, I mean the commercial world, where the kind of spirituality that you are describing from Aidan would just be it would just be laughed at. Now, is this a sense? Is this a reflection that our society has really gone so wrong that we have a long way to go to kind of reverse the values? Or is this a cultural difference? The Irish are very different from the Anglo-Saxons. Can you just explore that a bit more about power and about what we value?
Well, I wrote this book, which is trying to address capitalism's crisis, the cowshed revolution. Read the papers today on Prince Charles. After years when he's been written off as a crank who's irrelevant, people are beginning to recognise that he's been ahead of the time in saying that, for example, I have a daily prayer tweet, which goes first thing in the morning. I sent it out. Yesterday was please God, teach capitalists that the purpose of business is not to make a profit, but to meet a need profitably. If each business in the world sees its role as to meet a need profitably, rather than to make money regardless of any value to human beings, then we are going to have a sustainable world. So I think that the monastic values purity of heart. Everybody who works in a job needs to ask, is this a valid work? Okay, we may be selfish people and get doing things that's wrong, but is it basically a valid work, meeting a need? So I don't think that I think that this spirituality is absolutely fundamental to our survival as a civilization on Earth. It's urgent as well. It cannot be separated. But you're right, we've got a huge job to do, because politicians are elected for 5 years, so they have to do short-term things to get people to like them for the next election. And nearly all the things that need to be done are long-term things. So we've got to have a lot of people who are working for the long-term good, like Prince Charles.
You've said a lot about soul friends. At least 6 of us in this room are spiritual directors. I wondered if you'd like to say a little bit more about the advantage of direction and what it is not, is it then?
Yes. We use this word soul friend because the Irish word is Adam Cara, the friend of the soul. And the Irish